Last summer, I experienced the scariest thing of my life. I bought a new house. It was old, but very big. Everyone told me I was crazy. Still, I did whatever it took to get that house. I've always found old-style houses interesting. It was a beautiful country house, but it had some strange things about it. The house seemed to have been abandoned for a long time. The town I lived in was quite quiet, and people usually knew each other. So, when I moved in, I immediately started to gather information about the house's past. I had never met any of the previous owners. Some old people in the town said this house was unlucky, but I don't pay much attention to gossip like that. After all, I've always loved mysteries. One day, I started settling into the house. The inside of the house was quite big and chaotic. I began exploring almost every room. There were many old pieces of furniture, broken windows, paint peeling in places, once elegant, but now ruined wallpaper. Everything reminded me of traces from the past. On the first night, I was alone in the house. I chose the room where I would spend the night. The bed was quite big, but a bit old. At that moment, the silence in the house felt a little strange. There was usually such silence at night, but there was something different about it here. As the air cooled down, I heard a strange sound coming from deep inside the house. It was so faint that at first I couldn't believe my ears. But whenever the sound stopped, it would start again a few seconds later. At first I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't that ordinary. It felt like someone was moving inside the house. After a few sleepless hours, the sound started getting louder. In the middle of the night, I decided to get out of bed and check around the house. There was nothing. Every time I went to a room, the sound stopped. But that silence was even more terrifying. It was like someone was watching me. Taking a deep breath, I went back to my bed. But the moment I closed my eyes, I felt a strange coldness in the room. Something wasn't right. My heart began to race, but I couldn't make sense of it. By morning, everything seemed normal. However, I noticed a broken window in one corner of the house. Outside the window, there were muddy footprints. I was surprised and wondered why the footprints still looked fresh. And just then, I heard a scream from the forest outside. A loud and terrifying scream. It was like someone was really screaming. I waited there for a while, hoping the screams would stop. But whenever I decided to do something, a strange noise came from inside the house. There was a shape on the wall. That shape looked like a human face. But it wasn't a human face. It was more like a grotesque shape. Its eyes were missing, and its face had changed shape in a strange way. At that moment, I realized how terrifying it was to be alone there. I quickly checked around the house, but I couldn't find anyone. After all, this was a quiet town, but it wasn't that quiet. That night, I was alone in the house. Alone, but I never felt truly alone. After spending that night, I decided something was definitely wrong with the house. The next morning, I went back to the town and started talking to a few people. I asked questions about the old house, but no one gave me a clear answer. A few people mentioned that the people who once lived there had mysteriously disappeared, but no one said anything definite. I managed to stay alone in the house, but whenever evening came, a strange feeling would take over me. That night, something was watching me, and I didn't want to look at it. Suddenly, a shape appeared in front of the window, but this time it didn't look like a human. It was just dark. It was so dark that it could have been anything. At that moment, I felt like someone was looking inside my window. In that moment, a voice inside me said, "Don't stay in this house anymore." After that, I decided to leave the house, but that fear stayed inside me. This was the place they once called home, but it never felt like that again. I left that house, but I felt like something was still waiting there, like something was there to get revenge on me. When I returned to the town, everyone asked me if I was going to sell the house, but I didn't tell them anything. They would never know what really happened there. I wanted to get away from the city for a weekend escape. I wanted to spend a few peaceful and quiet days in nature. After some research, I rented a mountain house where I could be alone. The reviews were very good. It was calm, peaceful, and surrounded by nature. It was the perfect place. But the moment I rented that house, I took the first step toward the scariest experience of my life. When I arrived at the house, everything was quiet. Yes, it looked like an old house from the outside, but when I entered, I felt a strange unease. Every corner of the house was dark. The old walls were peeling, and the window panes were broken. But strangely, none of the furniture had been touched. It was as if no one had come here for years, yet everything seemed normal. At that moment, I relaxed a bit more, and entered without caring about the old atmosphere. The evening came, and when it was fully dark outside, I noticed something. Silence. It was so silent that I could hear my own breath in my ears. There was no sound in the house. Nothing was moving. There was a feeling inside me that disturbed me, but I ignored it. I closed the doors and windows and started watching TV for a while. At midnight, I woke up. I heard a rustling sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound began to become more distinct and regular. It felt like someone was moving inside the house. I slowly got out of bed and checked around. Everything was in its place, but my door was left open. I had closed it. My fear grew even more. I turned on the light and checked every room. There was no one. But something still felt off. I noticed that it had become very cold, despite having turned on the heater. It felt like someone was there, watching me. After a while, I noticed something strange on the porch. An old shoe, buried in the ground, but it looked new. At that moment, my fear grew. I started to think that someone was here. I was alone in the house, but that shoe must have belonged to someone else. I quickly went inside, and at that moment, I noticed something else strange in the house. The doors were open again. Everything seemed normal, but something wasn't right. As the night went on, the sounds increased. There was a rustling sound coming from every room, but no matter how much I checked each room, I found nothing. Suddenly, that strange silhouette on the porch appeared in front of my eyes. A shape of a man was appearing in the darkness. His movements seemed to be coming toward me. My heart started pounding. I quickly grabbed my cell phone and called the police. "They're following me," I said. "Someone is coming toward my house. Please come right away." At that moment, the man reached the front of the house. While waiting for the police, that silhouette got closer. He was running toward the house. He was inside. I could tell from the footsteps. I quickly hid in one of the rooms. I had one thing on my mind: to escape. I crawled toward the window. I slowly slid out of the window to avoid him hearing me. I was hiding in the dark. The man had come outside. He was still looking for me. Thank God. At that moment, the police arrived. When I saw the police come, the man hesitated, but it didn't take long for him to be caught. The police immediately arrested him. I still didn't understand what had happened. Fortunately, he was caught before it was too late. I learned at that moment that the man was a criminal. He had been missing for a long time, and it turned out he had been hiding in the forested area. The fact that he had been roaming around my house that night had terrified me so much. But there was one thing. This man wasn't alone. Because when the police entered the house, they found traces of another man. There was evidence of another presence in the house, but they couldn't find anyone. The next morning, everything seemed to return to normal, but what happened that night still follows me. I wasn't alone in that house. There was something in that house. The police solved everything, but remembering that night reminds me of how dangerous a place I rented.